Hello, my Built for 1000 Nation. How's everyone doing today? Hopefully, everyone's having a great day. If not, I hope it gets better from here. We are back with another Coffeehouse Crime. This one is titled Self-Entitled Teen Who Murdered His Family. The case of Alan Hruby. Hruby. I think that's how you pronounce it. All right, we've actually done, I believe it was a 3-parter. And it had this fucker in it. I did say I would like a little bit more information. And you wonderful people out there came through for me. There we go. And I am very excited. I don't know why I'm excited. I probably shouldn't be excited. I have a feeling it's going to be quite traumatizing because if I'm not mistaken, like it was quite traumatizing just listening to it on the 3-parter one. And 3-parter ones, I mean, it's only 5 to 7 minutes, and this here is 28. So I have a feeling it's going to get fucker. All right. I'm excited to see today's video. If you guys are excited as I am, go ahead, turn them lights down low, put on something comfy, couple something special. Let's get concerned for people's mental state.
Alan Hruby was a money-obsessed brat with a deep family bank account. And this video explores how this spoiled teen would go on to commit one of the most depraved acts imaginable by ending the lives of his entire family. With an unexpected change in the Hruby family's financial status, Alan was forced to adapt by cutting back on his luxurious spending habits. But instead of supporting his loving parents, he doubled down on theft and fraud, taking a sneaky trip to Paris in the process. After flying home, his family waited for him with the police at his doorstep. But even this didn't stop Alan and his uncontrollable obsession. In fact, he would do whatever was necessary to keep his hands on the money. Today, we will dive into the life of Alan Hruby and try to make sense of his terrible actions, which ultimately led to the murder of his entire family. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at one of the most insufferable teens to have ever existed. Now, some of you may have heard of his name before. Today, we're looking at the case of Alan Hruby and how he destroyed his family for money. By the way, Coffeehouse Crime is all about true crime, strange and chilling stories, and the best way you can support me is by subscribing to the channel. So, if you like coffee, cats, me, or simply darkly fascinating stories, then please consider subscribing. And now folks, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, pull up a seat and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of Alan Hruby.
And if you're needing something to grab your coffee in, think about getting yourself a nice B5N mug. We have different designs up all the time, and I try to link them, especially in my Coffeehouse Crime ones. They'll be down at the bottom of the video. Right down here. Yep.
Oklahoma. Welcome to the Sooner State, folks. Home to roughly 4 million residents, Oklahoma's forests and mountains span across the southern central region of the United States. It is known for its cowboy culture, Native American history, and jaw-dropping nature. But saying that, other dark surprises await you in this
Puppies with horns!
The terrible Oklahoma City bombing tragedy aside, have you ever heard of Pitcher? Pitcher was one of the most productive lead and zinc mining areas in the world, and was a busy town filled with residents and businesses. But now, it is an empty shell and an eerie ghost town. The town's residents reported high levels of lead in their blood, and the cancer rate suddenly skyrocketed. And that is when they realized that lead contamination in Pitcher had become extraordinarily dangerous. To this day, it is listed as one of the top 10 worst man-made environmental disasters in America. In fact, Pitcher was declared a Tar Creek Superfund site in 1981. And as for the EPA, well, they call it the most toxic place in America even to this day. Now, although this did become a ghost town overnight, some did decide to stay. But when a vicious tornado destroyed most of the remaining buildings in 2008, any straggling residents were basically forced to leave for good. Nowadays, it's an otherworldly ghost town left to decay and frozen in time as the rest of the world carries on. But our case today pulls us 250 miles southwest of this hellhole to the small town of Duncan, Oklahoma. And here we could find the Hruby family. John and Tinker Hruby were the perfect couple, living a comfortable and fulfilling life in their hometown as owners of their local newspaper. John's family owned the Duncan Banner for 3 generations before eventually selling it in the year 1997. After the sale, they purchased the Marlow Review in 2007, before then buying the Comanche County Chronicle in 2013. The Chronicle was their brainchild, and in their relatively small town of Duncan, Oklahoma, the family was well known and well respected in their community. And alongside their 2 children, named Katherine and Alan, the Hruby family thrived under the successful paper business. Their daughter, Katherine, was born on August 21st, 1997, and was described as bright, athletically gifted, naturally talented, and a very hard worker. And these traits translated well into her academics and her sports. By the time she was 17 years old and in high school, she was the star of her volleyball team. She also excelled in her social life, had many close friends, and was often the person people around her felt closest to. Katherine had the admiration of everyone that she knew. As she moved towards the end of her high school career, she was excited to begin university. And by the year of 2014, she was starting to plan which colleges she wanted to visit. Katherine's older brother, named Alan, was slightly older than she was. Born on May 8, 1995, he was 18 years old at the time this story takes place, and was a college freshman who was attending the University of Oklahoma. But despite being friendly and outgoing, something about him seemed to be rather different from his sister. At first glance, it was evident to all of the students around him that he came from money, or at least wanted to appear so. And while Katherine was a rather modest individual, Alan was quite the opposite. Alan was exuberant, and described by his friends and classmates as preppy. Some even went as far to say that he was rich and spoiled. Regardless of his outward appearance, those he hung around with seemed to genuinely like his company. He loved to party, was full of energy, and loved to make plans with friends. Those around him in high school and college would often describe Alan as a little bit crazy, though apparently in a good way. Living up to his so-called preppy personality, Alan loved to shop and spend money. Apparently, his favorite hobby was to go on holiday, and he'd spend his parents' money as often as possible. And like most of the rich narcissists out there, Alan took great pleasure in showing off his lifestyle and luxuries all over social media, and was no stranger in doing so.
I'm poor as shit. I don't do social media.
He posted almost daily about his whereabouts and what he was up to, often flexing fancy watches, expensive cars, or designer accessories.
Forget though.
Funnily enough, despite having a taste for the finer side of life, when it came to food, Alan's choice was no more expensive than what most of us enjoy from time to time. Because, as it turns out, he was a massive McDonald's fanboy, posting frequently on Twitter about his love for the Golden Arches. Alan loved to gobble whatever he could get his hands on, from Big Macs to Quarter Pounders to crispy chicken McNuggets. As an avid traveler on his parents' dime, Alan also liked to try McDonald's in various countries, sampling each and every special menu item that other places had to offer. And of course, all of this was being posted online for his so-called follower base to see. No surprise to anyone, it turns out that not many people cared about his day-to-day life. This is despite him listing himself as a public figure on Facebook, and even owning the domain alanhruby.com. So, despite never having an official diagnosis, after taking a look through his Twitter, it is not hard to believe that this guy was a total narcissist. As a self-proclaimed shopaholic, Alan loved anything and everything that revolved around money and spending his parents' hard-earned cash. Now, at first, this may have been seen as quirky, albeit very obnoxious, but at least to begin with, Alan was not overly zealous with spending, and his parents seemed to have a surplus of money. However, as time passed, what was initially innocuous would eventually take a toll on the family's finances, and with their business slowly beginning to decline, Alan's parents were worried. By the year 2014, and as Alan was gearing up to attend university, print media was slowly becoming outdated by modern technology. By now, the digital media industry, and most notably the internet, was growing with increasing intensity. And all in the meanwhile, newspaper companies were beginning to fall off. And so, while Alan's spending habits grew, his parents began to notice the real impact he was having on their finances. Now, at first, they took the hit themselves and started cutting back on their own expenses. However, with their son showing no sign of slowing down, they eventually came to a very hard conclusion. Alan needed to be cut off from their finances. It is important to highlight that when this decision was made, Alan's habit had progressed significantly. This was no longer a so-called bad habit. Instead, he had become a full-blown shopping addict. So, what do you think people with an addiction do when cut off from their supply? Because sometimes they use any means necessary to get it back. With no funds in his own bank account and cut off from his family's money, Alan began to grow desperate. To get by, he looked for weak points in the people around him, and sadly, the obvious choice was his grandmother. While it's not clear how Alan was able to dupe her, it is known that he managed to steal the numbers needed from her credit card, and was able to use it as he desired. And of course, the first thing he did after this was travel. With his grandmother's credit card in hand, Alan flew to one of his favorite destinations, Paris. And while there, he took photos of himself and his expensive adventures. When Alan finally had enough of his grandmother's funded joyride around France, he eventually returned home, though his family would not greet him as he expected.
Fuck no.
And instead, the police were waiting for him. Alan's father, John, had had enough. He could tolerate his son's behavior if it affected him alone, but his most recent escapade using stolen money from his grandmother was entirely out of line. And so, after spending over $5,000 of stolen money, Alan Hruby was arrested on felony charges. What may not surprise you, however, was that despite this show of force against him, he eventually got away nearly scot-free. And instead of ending up behind bars, Alan managed to scrape by with probation and a mandatory substance abuse counseling class. Now, you'd think that after blowing through his grandmother's money and having legal action taken against him, Alan would have learned something about his toxic behavior, and maybe even made an effort to do something about it. But sadly, in the end, nothing changed about Alan except for his attitude. The pampered and happy man was now nothing more than a spoiled brat, and his anger at having his funds taken away from him would actually grow daily. And concerningly, that was not the only source of negativity growing in his life. It is known that during this hardship, he went on to some less than respectable people for help to fund his addiction. And by the time this joyride through Europe was over and his access to his money was cut off, he found himself in thousands of dollars of debt to local loan sharks. With nothing to pay them back, the pressure grew, and unable to spend or pay back the money he owned, Alan was desperate. His comfortable and cushy world was crumbling down right before his eyes. And through all of this financial anxiety, Alan felt that something had to be done. Alan felt pushed beyond reason, and he believed that something had to be done so he could be freed from these new living conditions.
Get help.
So,
Better
what
help.
would
Do
you do
something.
in Alan's situation? Because for him, the answer was obvious. He needed to cash in big, and the best way he could do that was through life insurance. But the problem is, with healthy parents, that was
Can we get a life insurance dance? How to do it. For my dude Mike.
wasn't going to happen anytime soon. So, to reiterate, Alan was so obsessed with trivial spending that he was willing to murder his entire family to cash out on his inheritance. I mean, the ship has kind of sailed with this one already, but to make things even worse, he was not prepared to share it with his sister either. He believed that his family had betrayed him, and this was the only way to make things right. And tragically, all of this would come to a peak in October of 2014.
It's awful.
October the 9th, 2014. It was the typical Monday when Alan walked outside of his home and opened the door to his father's truck. With his mother and sister at home, his father had gone out for a short while, which played perfectly into his plot. Alan opened the car door and retrieved his father's 9mm handgun before locking the truck back up and walking back inside. And with the pistol gripped tightly in his hand, he felt adamant in his plans. For the first time since being cut off from his family's money, he felt like he was finally back in control. And as he entered the family home, he saw his first victim across the room, his very own mother. Tinker was sat down at the dining room table at the time. she never heard Alan approach her from behind, and it's unlikely that she was ever aware that Alan shot and killed her in cold blood. After taking his first shot, Tinker fell over onto the floor before Alan fired a second shot at his mother. His sister was outside of the property at the time, but after hearing the commotion, she ran inside to see what was happening. As she rounded the corner, she was greeted by her own brother pointing the firearm at her. Alan then fired his third shot, and just like that, she too was murdered. Alan then sat beside his mother and his sister for over an hour, patiently waiting for his father to return home. And sadly, after entering the property, John too was greeted with violent treachery. He was shot twice, with the second bullet killing him. With his family's fate now sealed, Alan secured the hard drive of the security system. Alongside the murder weapon, he fled the scene with both in hand, leaving what was once a beautiful family in his violent wake.
Dude's such a
It was
piece
4
of shit,
days
man.
later, around 9 AM on October the 13th, that police received a chilling phone call from a housekeeper.
No addiction is worth your family, bro.
1217. Yes, the Hruby's. Hruby.
What's the address, ma'am?
1217.
1217 what?
Bin Street.
What's going on?
I don't know, I just got here. I work for Mrs. Hruby, and all three of them are laying down on the floor in the kitchen.
Ma'am, you're gonna have to calm down. There's what?
There's Mr. and Mrs. Hruby and Katherine Hruby laying on the floor. I think they're dead.
They're not breathing? There's 3 subjects?
Yes, they're ice cold.
Have you checked to make sure they're breathing?
Yes, ma'am.
And they're not?
No, they're not.
You said 12... Ma'am, listen to me. Calm down, okay? 1217 Bent Tree? And it's a family?
Yes.
Police arrived on site and immediately treated it as a crime.
Man. Is that how actual 911 operators are? Like, I could understand what the lady was saying. Why do you have to keep having to repeat it? Like, you can hear her breaking down. Just get your shit, get the police there, and move on. You need to come. Bitch, I'm looking at dead people. You need to fucking calm down. What the fuck are you doing? You're answering a motherfucking phone. Go fuck yourself. You know what I mean?
Scene, keeping curious neighbors at bay while they began their own investigation. Nobody knew what precisely happened. Some
murder.
speculated if it was a robbery that had gone wrong.
It
while
was
some wondered
murder.
if someone in the family had snapped. What was clear, however, was that
Murder.
the fourth member of the family, their son, was nowhere to be found. So, where was Alan, and what happened to him after he ran away? Already intending to attend a college football game with a friend, Alan thought this was the perfect opportunity to create an alibi. He and his college roommate traveled to Dallas, Texas to see the game, where Alan treated both of them to the finest accommodation. And after checking into his glitzy room at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, he made sure to document and upload his luxuries to all of his social media profiles. So, although this seemed like a good idea in Alan's mind, let's not forget that he was still on probation for his previous money-related charges. Which, by the way, meant that leaving the state of Oklahoma was a breach of these conditions. To add to this, his alibi made no credible sense either, because if anyone looked into his purchasing history, they would realize he had plenty of time between the murders and Dallas. Back at his home in Duncan, the police were busy searching the property for any clues of what may have happened. And with Alan still missing, they were desperate to find him. Several officers would actually experience PTSD from the crime scene, as the house was covered in blood. But that wasn't the only disturbing thing they'd noticed. The family's state-of-the-art surveillance system, which was installed throughout the entire property, seemed to be missing its backup drive, and its footage was nowhere to be found. It quickly became obvious to detectives that they needed to locate Alan, and thankfully, it would only take 2 days to track him down. Alan was initially picked up on charges unrelated to the murder. I mean, he had broken his parole after all by traveling across the state's borders. The police were also looking into other potential charges, which included fraud. He had taken out another credit card in his grandmother's name and written over $17,000 worth of checks to himself.
Tonight, there is new information from one victim telling us how she says that Alan Hruby stole $17,000 from her. KOCO's Ariana Garza has inside details from a family member.
Robert Smith says Hruby stole the checks from his grandmother, Mary, who is friends with Hruby's grandmother. He says it all happened after Mary bought Hruby a graduation present this summer, and Hruby dropped by her home to say thank you while she was out of town. That's when Smith says the accused killer helped himself, stealing and writing $17,000 worth of checks.
The kid was very blessed and could have had a bright future.
Hruby's grandmother is already a victim. He pleaded guilty earlier this year to opening a credit card account in her name and spending close to $5,000 on it during a free trip to Europe.
Now, the police couldn't believe how low Alan was willing to go to fund his expensive addiction, but little did they know that it was only going to get much worse from here. With Alan now in custody, he was adequately informed about what precisely happened to his family. This was a big moment for investigators. Alan's reaction would offer insight into his involvement, and, being honest, he did put on a good show. Wailing and crying out loudly, he slapped on a facade of shock and grief. But officers watching him seemed to think that his reaction came from a different source of sadness. In reality, it didn't seem like Alan was actually mourning the loss of his parents. Instead, he was mourning the loss of money and reputation. Police were quick to assume that Alan was at least somewhat involved in the murder of his family, and it wouldn't take much time to coax a confession out of him either. He realized very early on that the game was already over, and that deception would only lead to a lengthier process.
Tell me about it. Tell me how it went down.
Yeah.
Did you shoot first?
Tell us, you little bitch.
My sister was home. She was outside washing her car.
Oh my god, he does sound like a little
She
bitch.
was at work still. And she walked in, and as soon as she went in the kitchen, I shot her.
How much longer?
I thought a girl was talking. His voice is so ladylike. Wow. I was about to say, I think the video's wrong because that's a lady talking. No, that was a... He's a real little bitch, ain't he? Holy shit.
Before Dad came home.
An hour or so.
An hour you had to sit in there with your dead mom and your dead sister?
Or so.
Where did you shoot Dad?
In the head.
To the detective's surprise, Alan admitted that he had been planning the murder for quite a while now, and thought that he had taken all of the proper preventative measures to avoid being caught red-handed. He went as far to leave his mobile phone back in his room on campus to elude the police on that fateful Monday morning. Though, ultimately, the disruption of his parole conditions would render that plan useless. Police also came to learn that Alan had actually been talking to his friends about killing his family, though, quite understandably, at the time, no one took him seriously. Supposedly, a rumor even returned to his sister about what he was saying, but she too failed to realize that Alan was serious. But in the end, after minimal pressure, Alan broke down and told the police his entire story. That the grand plan was to be the sole heir of his family, and that he owed thousands upon thousands of dollars to loan sharks. In the end, violent threats from these loan sharks are apparently what pushed him over the edge, or so what Alan wants us to believe. When police asked him where the murder weapon was, Alan claimed that he'd thrown it into a lake near the house. However, divers would ultimately come back empty-handed. But after digging a little deeper into Alan's life, detectives would find a storage locker that was rented by his grandmother that Alan used on the down low. And after breaking in, they found both the handgun and the missing hard drive to the home security system, giving them all the evidence they needed to sink him.
Why would you keep that?
Officers were also
Why
able
would you
to
keep
locate
any
the
of that?
security footage for the storage locker itself.
Melt the gun down with the hard drive. Never to be seen again. Fuck it.
Which would eventually show
Smelt that shit, bro. You can make your own smelter at the house. It's pretty easy.
his Jeep there in the parking lot on the day of the murder.
Even though police say Alan Hruby confessed to killing his family at their home, as investigators execute these search warrants, they're learning he didn't tell them the whole story. The murder weapon belonged to Alan's father, John. Investigators say Alan Hruby stole it from John's car as it sat in the driveway, and then later returned, firing 5 shots, killing John, Tinker, and Katherine. But it's what Alan did next that investigators say he lied about. Allen confessed to dumping the gun and a home security DVR at a nearby lake, but investigators found nothing. So officers searched a family storage unit, and that's where the supposed murder weapon was found, as well as a security system DVR.
Moving into court proceedings, police had more than enough to take him down before his trial began. I mean, not only did they have a plethora of evidence against him, but they also had a confession from Allen himself. By the time his trial began, local and national media had learned of his crimes, and further speculated that the death penalty might just be an option. And the county district attorney, who was actually a close friend of the family, made it clear that the death penalty was on the table. With such enormous potential consequences, Allen would go on to voluntarily plead guilty to his crimes in exchange for 3 life sentences. And as part of this guilty plea deal, he would forfeit his rights to any appeals in the future. This decision was made to spare himself the death penalty, and in the end, his surviving family were satisfied with this outcome. Side note, but death penalty trials are often very lengthy, and can take decades before the defendant is actually executed. Allen's family wanted to avoid the media circus that was inevitably going to be part of a lengthy death penalty case.
Fuck yeah.
I would like everybody here, I would make a request of not only the media but the public as well, and that is to respect the decision that this family has made, respect the decision that they made to allow Allen to enter a plea of guilty and take 3 life without parole sentences versus going through a death penalty trial which would have lasted a minimum of 3 weeks and probably a little bit longer than that, and then the 10 to 15 years worth of appeals. As you all have seen, Allen entered a plea of guilty to 3 counts of murder in the first degree. He's been sentenced to life without parole, and with the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, he will never be out of prison again. I made that decision based upon a conversation that I had with this family. They approached me last week and told me that they did not want to go to trial, that they did not want the stress of this trial.
Oh yeah.
Now, as much as the district attorney himself was actually rooting for the death penalty, he eventually relented and obeyed the wishes of the family. As part of his sentencing, Allen is now unable to contact his family whatsoever, and for the most part, they seem to be completely okay with this. 2 of Allen's family members would write to the DA, expressing on behalf of the family how they felt about Allen and his punishment. Tinker's father would say, "We feel that if Allen is given the death sentence, I will go to my grave not seeing justice carried out. If he is given life without parole, I may be able to rest in peace." John's sister would go on to say, "If the killer completely confesses his guilt and evil actions to the court by pleading guilty, I will accept that there will not be a trial and that he be sentenced for 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. He must remain in prison for the rest of his day." Another aspect of the plea deal involved Allen recounting what exactly happened on the day he murdered his family. Looking both sickly and malnourished, Allen slowly made his way to face the judge. He then turned to face the crowd and, painstakingly, through a voice broken by crying, described the events that led up to murder, visibly trembling while doing so. As for the maid who unfortunately stumbled upon the crime scene, she would later talk about the trauma she felt from viewing her longtime clients dead in front of her. The community itself was also dealing with trauma and grief, and many people who knew the family and were close to them were completely distraught. I know it's cliche to say, but no one anticipated this happening in a small town like Duncan, especially by a family member they knew.
Right, that's the real fucked in the butt part.
To the town, and it's clear how much the community absolutely loved the Hruby family. John and Tinker were generous and successful, not only in their professional careers, but their own personal lives too. They did everything they could to take care of their family and the people around them, and for this, they were significantly loved. Their daughter, Katherine, was a gleaming example of all the good that they were, and with a bright and kind head on her shoulders, she had a very prosperous future ahead. All for it to be tragically ended by her disgusting brother. They never expected that one of the people closest to them was capable of such great evil, and in the end, it was their generosity that was taken advantage of, and ultimately a factor in what got them killed. The town of Duncan recognized the impact the Hruby family had on the people around them, and in the end, they commemorated their good lives by inducting John and Tinker into the Journalism Hall of Fame. Many still find it hard to believe that the boy they once thought was an innocent college student, albeit a money-hungry narcissistic prick, could have the potential to murder his own flesh and blood.
He was just
Tell him, Adrian.
And I think that he knew he came from a good family, and he would use that definitely to his advantage.
Childhood friends with accused killer Alan Hruby describe a 19-year-old who loved the lavish lifestyle.
He was always the life of the party.
He was always cracking jokes, and I mean, I loved being around him.
And I was like, Mom, I had dinner with the murderer Sunday night. I can't describe, I looked into his eyes, I was cracking jokes with him, and the whole time he knew that he had killed three people.
After I heard about the credit card stuff, I expected that. I'm like, oh, that's something that I could see him getting in trouble for. But doing what he did, I was shocked. I did not think that he would have been able to do that.
It makes you mad almost that you respect a guy and you see him as a great friend, and then you hear what happened.
Friends say they never thought Alan's need for money would turn into a need for murder.
Right.
In the end, all it took was financial stress to turn a narcissistic son into a family murderer. And
that's awful.
Just like that, Alan Hruby snuffed out the lives
I don't give
of
two
all
shits
of
about
those
money, bro.
closest to him. To
You
this
got,
day,
you got,
he
you
sits
don't,
alone in a jail cell, unable to contact anyone from his life before prison. And without a mobile phone, he can't even brag about his meals behind bars either. It's a real sad story if you ask me, because all of these deaths were not necessary in the slightest.
Not at all.
Alan's family loved him, and perhaps they gave him too much.
Oh,
And when they had
100%.
to cut things back, he repaid his favor by murdering them. But yeah, that's the story of Alan Hruby. Thank you so much for watching, folks, and thank you for making it to the end. I really do appreciate you being here.
Well, I appreciate you having me here, Adrian, as always. Alright, I really enjoyed today's video. Thank you so much for letting me know that this one was out there. That way we got a more in-depth feel of the story. Alright, if y'all enjoyed today's video as much as I did, please go down there, leave a thumbs up. It really does help the channel grow. While you're down there, if you want, go on over and slap that subscribe button. Become part of the Bill 5000 Nation. We do some crazy stuff here. If you want to know when that crazy stuff happens, ding that bell and turn on all notifications. As always, be good to one another. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Oh, so fucked up. Why do we do this? Why?